Coming to you from the city of the weird. Exploring topics from the esoteric and unexplored to dimensions unknown. Shining a light of truth on the darkest corners of our reality. Welcome to the Curious Realm.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Curious Realm's continuing coverage of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference here in Denver, Colorado. We have the pleasure of being joined by researcher Roger Strittmatter. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Great
You
to
were
be here.
just giving a presentation a little while. Let's get into that presentation a little bit.
Okay, well, I have for a few years now been the editor of a series of books that the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship has been publishing on various aspects of the authorship question. We did two of what I hope will be a 5-volume series on Edward de Vere's poetry. One of the standard arguments that you will hear frequently from Shakespeare professors is, well, first of all, they say there's no authorship question. And if you persist a little further, they say, well, it couldn't have been the Earl of Oxford. And their two favorite reasons are they say that he died before some of the plays were written, and they say that he was an awful poet. He was a prolific, innovative, creative poet, especially in the 1570s. We regard those poems as essentially the juvenilia of Shakespeare. Traditional Shakespeare scholars don't really have any juvenilia. They start off with Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis, published in the early 1590s, which are long, complex, extremely well-crafted literary documents that cannot possibly be the work of a novice poet. They're a work of a poet who has already put in any number of years on his craft. So the first books are about de Vere's poetry, and then we've done several others. We did a book on Shakespeare and the law. And this is relevant because Shakespeare's knowledge of the law is very large. He uses numerous technical legal terms in ways that some of the best legal minds in Anglo-American history will tell us are routinely highly accurate, except when he is perhaps varying the legal concept, because after all, he's writing a drama. He's not writing a legal tract. So it has seemed to many people for a long time that whoever wrote the plays had a very solid grounding in law, which you don't get in Elizabethan England without first graduating from college and then going to the Inns of Court. So the question of Shakespeare's legal knowledge has always been inevitably wrapped up in the question of who actually wrote these plays and whether the traditional account that we're given is correct or not, because the man that we're told wrote these plays not only did not go to college, but had no association with the Inns of Court or sort of the legal community in Elizabethan London.
Sure.
We also recently have done a book on the Shakespeare First Folio. The First Folio is the collected works of Shakespeare, published in 1623. This is a posthumous publication, regardless of who you think the author was. And about half of the plays in it had never been published before.
And let's revisit that first book real quick, because one of the things that is very interesting is that concept of an early poet. I wrote poetry myself for years and years, and yes, there is a progression that happens to you as an artist, whether you're a musician, whether it's stagecraft, and it's fascinating because I definitely had my very good friend Billy. We would quite literally sit just like this, drinking coffee. He would be writing poetry. I'd be writing poetry. I don't think I ever, Roger, got rid of a page of poetry, ever. No matter the scrap, whatever. It's somewhere in a folder. My buddy would write things and just tear them up and burn them, throw them away. I don't know how he did it, but as a creator, I don't understand that. But I understand the idea of somebody evolving over time as a writer, somebody's skill and craft evolving over time as a writer. So let's explore the idea of, do we have any other early works of who we know as Shakespeare?
Well, that's a great question. It turns out that the second best playwright in Elizabethan England was anonymous. There's a whole series of play quartos which have some connection, an unclear connection to Shakespeare that appear anonymously. Some of those actually were collected and accepted as being by Shakespeare in the folio many years later. And then there's a whole nother group that sort of hover in the purgatory of not having an author. Many of us believe that those plays are, so I told you that Edward de Vere's lyric poetry corresponds to his Shakespeare's Juvenilia in the world of poetry.
Yeah.
I think these anonymous plays are function in the same way with respect to the development of his dramatic skill and his dramatic techniques. And this is related to the point I mentioned that people say, well, Edward de Vere, whose dates were 1550 to 1604, that he died before some of the plays were written. But the truth of the matter is, there is no chronology of the writing of the Shakespeare plays that is really independent of an assumption or premise about the life of the author. And the most honest Shakespeare scholars who've studied the chronology will admit this. They say this. They admit it. So what we have is we have a situation where there is very imperfect and incomplete data about all these plays.
Yeah.
And the assumption is frequently made that they must have been written a year or maybe at most 2 years before their earliest mention in the historical record. This is manifestly not true for any number of plays. What is also true, very clearly, is that at least some of these plays we have definitive evidence for long delayed publication.
Why would that be?
Well, the interesting thing is that when you look at the plays by genre, the genre that has the most examples of plays that were delayed, I'll use As You Like It as an example. As You Like It is registered in 1600, 3 years before the death of Queen Elizabeth, 4 years before the death of Edward de Vere. It's in the registration, it says when he hath got sufficient authority for it, which is essentially a registration that is saying, okay, you paid your sixpence, you own the play, but the registration itself is not going to allow you to publish because somebody of greater authority has to sign off on this. So, As You Like It, registered 1600, apparently performed in 1603. That's the earliest performance date we have for it. That is contested, but I believe that is real. I think that's a true data point. But it's not published until 1623.
Fascinating.
So indeed, I would say, with respect, would bounce your question back to those who would defend the traditional view. First of all, they have said repeatedly, oh, it's so silly. The Oxfordians say that these plays were kept in a trunk for 20 years. They were kept in a trunk for 20 years, at least a number of them. Obviously and unambiguously were kept in somebody's trunk somewhere for many years. I would say that the reason the comedies have a particular problem with being published is just simple censorship. We all know that comedy, what do we say about comedy? You had to be there. Yeah. That means that comedy in its origin, however much it may escape that and aspire to universality, is about specific people and circumstances and time.
It's details.
It's details, and also it's details about real people who are being made fun of. Now, the being made fun of may be gentle or it may be harsh. Yeah. And in Shakespeare, I believe it is both, depending upon where you look. But Oxfordians, in my experience, are much better, that is, people who believe that Edward de Vere wrote the plays, are much better than our Orthodox brethren at identifying what some of those comic problems are. Sure. And they relate to people who we know that Edward de Vere, the real author of the plays, had personal beefs with. So it's not surprising to see him taking out those beefs by writing comedies. And so these people are alive, their relatives are alive, And so some of those plays really could not be published until, well, I'll give you my favorite example. In Twelfth Night, Sir Andrew Aguecheek is a pretty clear parody of Sir Philip Sidney. Now, Sir Philip Sidney is a national hero in Elizabethan England. There is nobody who is more worshipped by the Protestant community in England than Sir Philip Sidney. And he's an intellectual, and he wrote a book in defense of poetry and wrote his own poetry. He's a very interesting man. But everyone knows who studies the period that he and the Earl of Oxford had serious beefs. It began when they were young because Sir Philip Sidney was engaged to be married to Anne Cecil. And then when William Cecil, her father, found out that maybe he could marry him to Edward de Vere, that was called off, and she married Edward de Vere. That was kind of maybe the beginning of what had been a friendship turning into kind of a personal rivalry. So this is a bitter mockery of a famous man loved by so many. The folio was published in 1623. What's interesting is that Philip Sidney's sister, Mary Sidney, lived until 1621.
Oh.
And it's her two sons, William and Philip Herbert, Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, who are the two noble patrons of the Shakespeare First Folio. One of them, the younger brother Montgomery, was married to Edward de Vere's daughter Susan. The other one, the elder brother William, was at one time engaged to marry another of Edward de Vere's daughters. So as a longtime researcher Ruth Lloyd Miller has said, the First Folio was a family affair. And like any family, it was a family with conflicted interests. Mary Sidney would not have approved of the publication of plays that mocked her famous brother.
Well, and specifically, especially the callback to comedy, like you were saying, the funniest jokes are inside jokes. The funniest jokes are ones that you were in on, or that you know the situation.
Right.
So yeah, when you're talking about these things being sometimes possibly commissioned as political prop up for the crown.
Yes.
Things like that. You would have had to have been in the know. You couldn't have been an outsider and written that joke.
Yes. And the traditional myth that we're told by the Shakespeare scholars is all these plays were written for the public stage. Nonsense.
Yes.
Some of them were written for the public stage, especially
I think they ended up there.
They all ended up there sooner or later.
Yeah.
But again, we could make a distinguish by genre is that the comedies tended to be written for more of a select audience.
Yeah.
And only over time did they kind of escape that.
Yeah.
But there's lots of evidence for this kind of conflict. Another really good example is Troilus and Cressida. Troilus and Cressida is one of the strangest plays in the Shakespeare canon because, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote essays on all or almost all the Shakespeare plays, says he ran away from Troilus and Cressida because all the characters in it seem to have gone to a medieval university. It's a deeply erudite, intellectual retelling of this ancient story of the fall of Troy and the relationship between Troilus and Cressida. That's another play that is registered in 1603 when he hath got sufficient authority for it. Now, it finally does appear 6 years later in a quarto version. That the quarto is a small book with just one play in it. But it's wild because there's only one quarto in 1609, but it exists in two different versions. Bibliographers call these two states. And the first state was interrupted, and the first pages of it, the title page, was torn out. A new title page was put in it with an introduction. And all this stuff, I don't want to get too far into the weeds.
That's okay. It's okay.
But the point is that there was real problems with this play for the kind of reasons that we've been talking about.
I mean, the thing is, what the audience needs to understand is translations did not exist. at that point. For
Mostly,
mostly.
correct.
It's
Correct.
not like you could go to the public
Correct.
library and pull out
Right.
a copy of The Fall of Troy
Not at all.
and read it. You would have had to have read that in the original Greek, in the original Latin, in the original whatever language it was, which once again bears the fact of an educated person wrote this. Somebody
Yes.
who was able to read the original
Correct.
text and translate it into a modern time.
Correct.
And into a modern situation.
Correct. And that has been obscured for centuries, really, because of a statement that Ben Jonson, as a younger colleague of Shakespeare's, and in the first folio, Jonson has a long 80-line encomium poem of praise to Shakespeare, and it contains the line, "And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, for names to praise you I would not seek." And then he goes on to name a bunch of classical dramatists. And this has been misunderstood to mean that Ben Jonson is saying that Shakespeare has small Latin and less Greek. It's actually the opposite of that. If you've studied even a little bit of either one of those languages, you may encounter something called a contrary to fact hypothetical statement, which is what this is. He's saying even if you had small Latin and less Greek, but you don't, you actually have a lot,
Yeah.
I would still praise you by comparison
That's
to
right.
those ancient Greek and Latin dramatists.
Yeah, it's a shorthand for if this then.
Correct.
And that brings up a fascinating point. I myself am an Oxfordian. I'm a big believer in Edward de Vere, but there's so many. I mean, good God, I watch Curse of Oak Island. That's one of the hypotheses of Oak Island, is that the missing Shakespeare manuscripts are in the bottom of I don't know why
But
you would
have
have
they
to hide
found
the
anything now?
Shakespeare manuscripts in the bottom of Oak Island.
Right.
But it goes to Francis Bacon. It goes to Marlowe. Where do all of these come from? Where do all of these possible authorship hypotheses source from?
Okay, then again, very good question. I would say that the wide diversity of people that have been proposed, and it's actually as many as like over 70 possible candidates. I think this indicates the depth of public discontent with the traditional account, which is wholly justified in my opinion. However, in my reading of the intellectual history of the dispute, really starting in 1920 when John Thomas Loney first proposed that Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, was the real author, I believe that theory has ever since then been by far and away more persuasive than the other theories. But lots of people actually knew about the reality, that there was an authorship question, and many people knew that it was Edward de Vere. But you were not to speak about it in public. It was just not done. And you didn't write about it openly. If you knew about it, you wrote about it covertly, using, they had many very sophisticated techniques for sort of speaking in tongues about subjects that you were not supposed to speak about openly.
And especially the way that, like you were talking about, or like we spoke about earlier, the idea that he ended up going with somebody else's fiance, the fact that his family goes back to the 1000s. You're talking about a lot of intermarriage within royal families, things like that. So the idea of his family going back so far, him possibly marrying into the royal family, you could possibly see how for a while you might want to obscure that fact of authorship, to make sure that 3-4 generations down the line, somebody's castle doesn't get taken because somebody finds out, like, oh, you wrote that thing about my uncle? Your uncle wrote that about my uncle? Your parcel is gone. No more vassals for you.
Exactly so. And, I think there are people, view this very anachronistically. We're like, well, why wouldn't Shakespeare want to take credit for what he wrote? I mean, and yet what we don't realize is a couple of layers. We already talked about the politically explosive character, potentially the dramas. Yeah. And I believe that's a significant part of it. But there's also something called the stigma of print, which is essentially the idea that aristocrats were not supposed to soil their hands with doing work for money. Yeah. And that included writing plays or acting. It did not include, by the way, being the patron of a dramatic troupe. And in fact, the way that the Elizabethan state and also the Jacobean state after it operated was that you could not be an actor unless you wore the livery of a nobleman. And that was the way the state could enforce policy against actors who might, Hamlet has a thing where he says, don't to the comic actors, don't say anything that's not written down for you. That's what that's about.
Yeah.
Don't go beyond your prerogative or you're going to get in trouble. And the way the trouble's going to happen is going to come down through the noble patron.
Yeah, through the chain of command in that kind of way. Right. And
so there are multiple reasons why the author of these plays actually capitulated is the word I would use to him basically being erased from history.
Be faceless,
Yes.
And even the idea of he himself was patroned by the crown. The fact that Edward de Vere's got what would equivalent to now like $1 million a year endowment from the crown.
Correct.
And yes, he was a patron. It was great to be a patron of the arts, but you couldn't be the one writing the plays. What are you doing?
And I agree. When I speak about Orthodox Shakespeare scholars, I'm critical of many of their assumptions, but I've learned a tremendous amount from them. They're completely correct when they say that whoever wrote these plays was an actor.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's a whole nother layer of scandal. That's in some ways even worse, is that we're talking about a noble playwright who, in my opinion, I cannot imagine, we don't have definitive proof of this, I cannot imagine that he did not enjoy dressing up in women's clothes. Why would I say that? Because this is a playwright who's a male playwright, I believe, but one whose understanding of female psychology is extraordinary.
It's fantastic. It's incredible.
He has to have been deeply in touch with his own feminine side. And this is would have been terrifically scandalous.
Yeah.
We're talking about an England that is divided by religion, and there is a strong anti-theatrical sentiment coming from both sides, both from the Puritan side and from the Catholic side as well. The town council in London, the aldermen, whenever they had a pretext, like if there was plague in London. But it wasn't really, there was a public health rationale when there was plague to shut down the theater. But it's beyond that. It's like they wanted an excuse to shut the theater down. And when you read the documents of control of the theater, what you see over and over again is that the aldermen will shut down the theater, and then Queen Elizabeth will say, well, they have to practice because they're going to perform before me next week. So maybe you should open up the public stage. That dynamic goes back and forth.
Yeah.
She was a powerful supporter of the theater in general, maybe not in certain particular cases, but as a general principle. And as you mentioned, one of the really interesting things about Edward de Vere's biography is that starting in June of 1586, in June of 1586, which was the year in which the Elizabethan state reorganized its censorship laws, and this was one part of that reorganization, the Queen authorized under a Privy Seal warrant, which means that this is essentially an intelligence service level document.
Need to know basis.
Yeah, which literally says that the grantee, neither the grantee nor any of his heirs shall ever be required to account for the expenditure of these monies. She began to give him £1,000 a year. At the same time, the state's expense through the Office of Revels declines by approximately the same amount of money.
Wow.
So it's very clear that what she was doing was essentially contracting out to Edward de Vere the responsibility for basically funding the greater part of the Elizabethan theater.
Yeah, at least the private creation of things that, once again, may have eventually ended up in the public domain, though they were for the court originally, for their entertainment. Like, once again, absolutely an inside joke. Let's perform this thing for the audience that it was written for.
Yes.
And then it ended up going to the public theater.
I would say what you just described matches the comedies perfectly, but I would say that there's another aspect to it, which is that the history plays were intended for the public theater. Why? Well, 1586 is an interesting moment in time because that's only 2 years before Spain launches the Armada against England, and they knew this was going to happen. They needed to stir the patriotism of the English public, and a number of these plays, especially think a play like Henry V, for example, is probably the most obvious example. That Agincourt Day speech is the ultimate of rousing the rousing of a sense of national consciousness in defense of the English way of life. So I think it was both the subsidies supported both comedies on a more private level and some of these other plays that were expressions. They were not, this is a hard thing to say, so they were propaganda expressions of the Elizabethan state's intention, but never reductively so, because we're talking about a creative genius who was a disruptor, and so he actually makes jokes about this in the plays. In Comedy of Errors, there's the two Dromios. One of them says, "I buy £1,000 a year. I buy a rope." Well, the word "buy" is a little bit of, that doesn't sound like he's being given £1,000, but when you see that there's a rope attached to the £1,000, that's what it is.
Yeah.
He's joking about the £1,000 and talking about it as a rope. And in the sonnet,
holding him back.
Holding him back, yeah. And the sonnets, the line is "public means which public manners breeds." The sonnet writer is complaining about public means which public manners breeds. Now that is a line that our Orthodox colleagues have no clue what it can possibly mean. But to us, it is a direct poetic reference to the £1,000 annuity.
Wow.
And the fact which public manners breeds, that's the rope, basically, right?
Yeah. And once again, the idea of keeping this secret for generations so that inheritances wouldn't be taken, properties wouldn't be taken, things like that. Why continue it? Why continue it now, Roger?
Well, of course, that's a very good question. And I think it's still a political issue. I think the character of the politics has been transformed over time. You have had since 1767, when the first Stratford Jubilee was held by David Garrick in Stratford-upon-Avon, you have had the development of a multi-$100-million-a-year tourist industry.
Yeah.
With huge real estate holdings in and around Stratford and a need to keep the tourists coming in. And then on top of that, you have, maybe around 3,000 Shakespeare professors in the world. And although their livelihood is not really threatened by our heresy at all, I don't even think that Stratford-upon-Avon is threatened by our heresy, although that is dependent on their response to the challenge, right? I don't think it need to affect any of that, but people think that it does. And, I sympathize. I know that if you're trained for years, you go to graduate school and you're told that this is not a topic that responsible scholars talk about, then you will avoid it. And unfortunately, the result is a huge information gap now.
That's right.
I believe in my lifetime, I've been involved in this for about 30 years.
Wow.
And the volume of new evidence that has been produced is absolutely staggering.
It is.
It's staggering. And yet, our Orthodox colleagues, for the most part, know virtually nothing about it.
Well, and I think a lot of that is because, while they look at very traditional research, reading techniques, breaking it down within the culture of the time somewhat, which is odd to me because there are things like, really, a common person in the 1600s could just write like that? I don't think so. Not the way it was at all. But...
Well, especially when you look at the content of the works.
Yeah.
The most common noun in the whole Shakespeare canon is the word Lord.
Yeah.
And that's not the Lord in a religious sense, it's the Lord in a social sense.
Yeah, in the vassal
So,
sense.
yeah, there's no question that these plays reflect a worldview that is distinctly aristocratic.
Yeah.
And that being the case, if you really believe that upwardly mobile, highly successful, petty bourgeois, he's not a peasant. Sometimes people, no, that's not right. He was a very successful man financially, but he may have gone to the Stratford Grammar School, but even that cannot be proved. He didn't go to college. He didn't go to the Inns of Court. He didn't travel. And he certainly was, John Thomas Loney said it best in Shakespeare Identified as Edward de Vere in 1920. He said, anybody who follows Shakespeare's advice about money will soon be in bankruptcy proceeding, because Shakespeare's beliefs about money are
totally
not
unrealistic
that you
require,
especially if you're trying to save money to get ahead in the business world.
Yeah.
His attitude about money is very much the noblesse oblige, to give it away.
You got to spend money to make money.
Well, and you should, and he believed he was anachronistically a believer in charity, in good works, and again, that fingerprint matches de Vere in very precise ways. There are multiple accounts of his excessive generosity. And I shouldn't say excessive, but the reason I say that is because it's also clear that he was not a good money manager, and he was born an incredibly wealthy man. He lost money his whole life. That's not what he was interested in.
Yeah.
He wanted to fund the arts and be an artist and to support other people in making art. And so he frequently ran into financial problems and literally spent most of his life selling off his inherited properties in order to keep himself afloat financially. Now, the one thing I should add to that that's important to realize is this is a man who, when he was 12 years old, his father died. And therefore, he became what's called a ward of the court, which means that his vast estates were managed by government bureaucrats. And he was 12 years old. He did not escape from the financial obligations that he incurred through his wardship until he was probably around 30 years old. And so imagine this: if you're managing this young nobleman, he's 12 or 13 years old, and you're getting a percentage of everything that he spends, you are not going to raise him to be spendthrift, or to be economical. You're gonna encourage him to spend money. So that's the kind of financial training he had in his teens when he was being told that he had so much it would never run out.
Well, and that's an interesting point to bring up, the idea of him being brought up by somebody other than his family, because he was brought up by his uncle, correct?
Well, not quite. Although his uncle Arthur Golding was his Latin tutor. That's the connection,
and also a publisher.
Well, he was also the main manager of the de Vere estates so it is really complex relationships. But the household that he lived in was run by William Cecil, otherwise known as Lord Burleigh. Now, William Cecil is a very remarkable man. He became the most powerful man in Elizabeth's government. His enemies called him King Cecil. That's how powerful he was, and he obtained that power by as a young lawyer at about, I think he was about 30, in 1548, Princess Elizabeth, who was not yet queen, she was involved in a sexual scandal because her protector, who was married, she was living in his household, and the evidence shows that he was doing everything he could to jump her bones, because that would put him in a politically advantageous situation. Absolutely. It appears that she became pregnant, and she was not seen for a number of months, and when she returned to court, it was William Cecil who put on the show that brought her back. And the first thing she did 2 years later, no, it would have been 5 years later, 1553, when she came to the throne, she said, "Send me William Cecil." And he became her principal secretary. He became the Lord Treasurer of the realm, and he became the in loco parentis authority raising the young Earl of Oxford after his father died in 1562.
Wow.
So it was in his household that the young Edward de Vere would have received an education. He had the best tutors available in England, Arthur Golding in Latin, Noel, can't remember Noel's first name right now, but Noel in Anglo-Saxon. Noel owned the Beowulf manuscript.
Oh, wow.
And we have a fascinating letter from him with, I think it's in 1563 when de Vere was 13 years old. He writes to Burleigh and says, I can see that my work for the Earl of Oxford will no longer be required. Now, one might interpret that in many ways. I've heard somebody say, well, he wanted to get rid of the kid because he was such a badass. But more likely, it was that he had already mastered Anglo-Saxon at the age of 13. All of the evidence suggests that he was a genius in languages, and he brought multilingual awareness. You mentioned, being able to read Greek and Latin.
Yeah.
He read Italian. He wrote French by the time he was 12 years old. I believe if he knew Anglo-Saxon, he could have done German pretty easily as well. So he was really steeped in the same kind of cultural preparation that lies behind the plays.
Yeah.
And Cecil, he and William Cecil had a very complicated relationship. They were both geniuses, but of opposite spectrum. Cecil was a genius at statecraft and the founder of the modern Secret Service through his friend Francis Walsingham. Very practical. It's sometimes said, well, he didn't approve of the theater. That's not really true. He did approve of theater, but it had to be in the interests of the political stability of the realm.
That's right.
If it didn't have that didactic purpose, he didn't approve of it. And of course, de Vere didn't care about that. I won't say he didn't care about it. I think he remained certainly loyal to Queen Elizabeth, but he had other larger considerations than that.
Yeah.
Look, he knew he was hell on wheels. He knew that. He knew that he was a world historical genius. He wasn't dumb. He could figure that out. And if you read the sonnets, I would really encourage your listeners to read the sonnets and especially pay attention to the sequence between Sonnet 71 and Sonnet 76, because he really tells you the whole story in those sonnets. He tells you, the writer says that his name has been taken from him, and he says that he tells his readers, don't rehearse my name when you read this. Don't say my name, because the wise world, as he puts it, the wise world will look into your moan and mock you with me after I am gone. I can't for the life of me see what traditional Shakespeareans can make of that, which may explain why those are not sonnets that they regularly expose their students to. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That's fine.
Sure. But yeah, if you didn't understand the story of his connection, of de Vere's connection, and the fact that de Vere may be the author, then it would be utterly nebulous.
Correct.
What's being spoken about.
Correct. And one can go beyond that even as an Oxfordian. His motto was vero nihil verius, which means nothing truer than the truth. There are, if you again read the sonnets, and within that group that I described, I'm sorry I can't do them from heart. I'm not that good at memorizing things, but
great.
He rings multiple changes on that de Vere family motto in those sonnets. He's alluding to it in the language that he uses. I said that he capitulated. He did capitulate. Here's an interesting example of why he capitulated. So I was able to study Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible, which is at the Folger Shakespeare Library today. It was purchased by Henry Clay Folger in 1925. One of the big lies in the modern Shakespeare industry is that Henry Clay Folger, although they admit he was at one time interested in the authorship question, and he collected Baconian books and stuff on the Bacon as the author, and they say, well, he gave that up. He was no longer interested in it. Yeah. But the truth is he continued his interest, but he shifted his focus to Edward de Vere in the mid to late 20s. And I think he died in around 1928. So just a few years after he purchased this Bible. So it turns out that there are over 1,000 underlined, marked, and annotated passages in Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible. It is bound with his coat of arms. There is no disputing that it originally was his. That is what Henry Clay Folger bought it as Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible. And one of the annotation patterns in it is in Matthew 6:1-4, which essentially says, this is Jesus' rebuke to the Pharisees, and he says, when you give your alms and you do your works, do not blow your trumpet in the marketplace. So this was a religious precedent. It was used actually by William Tyndale. When William Tyndale translated the Bible into English for the first time, he did not put his name on the translation.
Yeah.
And this was contrary to the statutes of Henry VIII, which said that any translation had to have the translator's name. Why? Because translations historically are notorious for not just being translations.
They can be adaptations. A prime example would be Beowulf. Not a direct translation, but more than likely changed by the translator to be slightly more Christian in tone.
Well, indeed. So and very often, if you study this, you'll find that translators have their own political perspective, and a great way to express your political perspective and get away with it is to translate something, because then you got plausible deniability.
That's right.
And so Tyndale was eventually, about 6 or 8 years after he had published this, he was hunted for a long time, and eventually he published a book where he admitted that it was his translation, and he said that the reason why he didn't put his name on it was because of Matthew 6:1-4. He was following the admonition of Jesus to not blow his trumpet in the marketplace. Now, of course, that's a half-truth, right? The other half of the truth is that his life could have been forfeit if he put his name on it. And eventually his life was forfeit. He was eventually burned at the stake by Henry VIII. Only 2 or 3 years before Henry VIII became Protestant, because he saw Anne Boleyn, right? Yeah. Crazy world. Crazy world. Our world is crazy, but in very other ways.
You couldn't make up the play about it.
Quite.
And that's just it. The idea that these plays, especially the comedies, things like that, were reflections of the society around him, reflections of quite literally the world that he was steeped in.
Yes.
It's just fascinating once you really start giving it that forensic treatment like you have, which once again, when you're looking through a textbook, when you're going over a generalized curriculum that's been the same curriculum almost for a decade, with maybe a new edition of a book along the way or something like that, or a new annotation to a new edition. It can be hard to look at things in that kind of forensic way. Even when we were talking with Don earlier, he taught theater history, and the idea that wow, I taught theater history, and these things never even, the history of the time and the theater history not being able to shake hands, never even registered. Right. Never even registered.
Right. Because the truth is, I believe that you're trained as a Shakespeare scholar, or really as dealing with any part that could touch on Shakespeare, you are steered completely away from that.
Yeah.
And I saw that in my graduate experience. I was fortunate. I was in a comparative literature department, and I did the work I was just describing to you about Edward
which is phenomenal.
Bible. Yeah.
Wow.
And it produced my pursuit of this question produced a crisis within the university, because not everybody, but there were some people in the English department who were like, "Why are you letting your comp lit students study Shakespeare? That's our turf." Not to mention the fact that he's telling you a lot of nonsense because he doesn't accept, our paradigm and our assumptions. So it did, and I was very fortunate because I had a number of professors, really most of the department in Comp Lit, who really supported me and saw the issue as one that required a more open-minded perspective.
Absolutely. And it's one of those, Roger, the fact is, history is truly so much a working hypothesis. Because it's written by the victors. Until you find the loser's manuscript, you rarely get the other side of the story.
Yeah.
And that's a prime point to bring up and to wrap this up with is the idea of you have to be both a student of history and a student of the literature of Shakespeare.
Absolutely. And you can go even beyond that. One of the ways this has taken me is an interest in handwriting because, I had this Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible. And of course, one of the first things I did was to try to be sure that the handwriting in it was actually his. It was his Bible, but that is at least a hypothetically legitimate question. So I just start learning about, what do forensic handwriting experts do? How do they do that? And that turns out to be relevant. The Stratford man, 6 signatures is the sum total of his handwritten work that has survived. Yeah. And even those may not all be by the same person.
That's right.
So they have this horrible dearth of relevant evidence. We, on the other hand, have an overwhelming and expanding, galaxy of evidence.
Yeah.
So we need people that are interested in all of these things and are willing to think in an interdisciplinary way and bring whatever tools are necessary to the table to try to get a better understanding of what really did happen in the past.
Absolutely, because like we say on the show regularly, I don't care if you're talking physics, I don't care if you're talking paranormal like we do regularly on the show, or even if you're talking this or history or lost history. Research does not happen in a vacuum. It cannot just happen by one person. You've got to be able to share data. You've got to be able to have even a disagreeing conversation in an open mind, and you've got to be willing to kill your darlings. Even if you're the one that posed the hypothesis, you've got to be the one willing to put the shell in it to shoot it down.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the conversation. This has been fantastic.
Chris. Yeah.
Let everybody know where they can go to keep up with your work, where they can go to buy books, where they can go to find more about the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship.
Okay, well, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship has a wonderful website. There is our sister organization in England, the De Vere Society, that is pursuing the same objectives. They have many very famous. Sir Derek Jacobi is one of their patrons. Wow. Yeah, I mean, a lot of really famous Shakespeare actors are into this. And so when people say to me, well, all the experts say you're wrong, I'm like, you're saying that Derek Jacobi is got to be in the top stratosphere of Shakespeare experts. He's acted in almost all the plays, maybe all of them, some many, many times. And when you have to act those plays, you have to know them. Anyway, so the De Vere Society they have these impressive patrons. And my own website is called shake-spears-bible.com. And that includes materials on my the De Vere Geneva Bible research and a lot of the stuff I've been doing since then.
Well, I would love to have you back on again and again to talk about this continuing research, because it's something, as a theater kid, it is near and dear to my heart. The theater is why I do what I do for a living.
Yes.
And this has just like reignited my love for Shakespeare.
As it should.
Because
this is the sad part about the opposition to us, is that many of us are people who reconnected with Shakespeare.
Absolutely.
Because we thought, oh, wow, isn't this an interesting story? I wonder if it's true, and I wonder if you explore it as a hypothesis, can it teach you more about the works? And the answer in my experience is a lot.
Whenever I have this topic on my show, the turn of phrase I use is, it doesn't take a shovel, it only takes a trowel. It's just a scraping across the surface of evidence that will lead you down the rabbit hole, because there's not a lot there. There's no original complete manuscript. Every manuscript in the folio is assembled from parts, most of them incomplete. Like you said, we have all of 6 signatures, none of which actually match of
Anything
the man
else,
from Avon.
yeah.
So, yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much again for your time. I greatly
Thank you,
appreciate
Chris.
it. It's
I
been a
appreciate
great
it.
conversation.
Okay.
While you are online checking out all of the great work of Roger Strittmatter, make sure to stop on by Curious Realm. CuriousRealm.com is where you can like, follow, subscribe. That is where you can find all of our episodes from this and other live events. Stay tuned through this quick break. We'll be right back with our continuing coverage of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference right here in Denver, right after this.
The key to good science is good research. At the heart of good research is a good data set. With the field observation and encounter log from Curious Research, you can easily keep track of your investigative information all in one place, making it easier to review cases and readily see comparisons and contrasts between them. Whether out in the woods squatching, in a back room gathering EVPs, or using high-tech gear to track UFO, UAP activity, this easy-to-carry, pocket-sized scientific data log is the perfect companion for any field researcher. You can find your copy of the Curious Research Field Observation and Encounter Log at Amazon.com or visit the official Curious Realm store at CuriousRealm.com/store to reserve your copy for yourself, your family, or a mind that you want to open. That website again is CuriousRealm.com/store.